Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome back to another episode here on The Plant Path. And today I want to share a little bit about integrative global herbal medicine. And one thing I always like to think about that I think is kind of an interesting thing to think about actually is, so we're called evolutionary herbalism here, right? Well, one thing I like to think of is the evolution of herbal medicine itself, like how the relationship between people and plants and the development and practice of medicine that came up around that relationship has changed throughout time. From the first person that had the genius insight to pick a plant and either put it on a wound or put it in their body to heal themselves or someone else, to the development of many folk traditions and indigenous approaches to herbal medicine, to that evolving into more kind of developed systems of medicine, that were written down like the great traditions that we tend to think of, very established systems like Chinese medicine, like Ayurveda, like Galenic or Greco-Roman medicine, to in the Middle East, Unani Tib medicine, physiomedicalism, right? That there are these traditions that developed around using the plants. So I tend to think of those as kind of like the vitalist systems or traditions of herbal medicine, and then how that gradually evolved into kind of more of our modern biomedical model of science, right? And understanding people on an anatomical, on a physiological, on a biochemical level, understanding the plants on their pharmacological level, and how that's transformed herbal medicine, and how here we are, now in this, at the time of filming this, 2023, and we're seeing kind of this conglomeration of all of them together right now, where we see people working with medicinal plants accordingly to, folk tradition or indigenous traditions, their ancestral traditions of herbal medicine, and sometimes, integrating that in with, say, Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or traditional Western herbalism, and at the same time being able to utilize, a modern scientific approach to understanding people and plants alongside with that. So we're at this very unique time in the evolution of herbal medicine where we have access to vast amounts of information, right? The information that, 100 years ago, people had to travel across the world to learn things like that, right? If someone wanted to learn Ayurveda and they lived in the Americas, it's like, hey, you had to travel to India and find someone to teach you and learn the language. And, it's like, it's pretty amazing just where we're at right now. And yet at the same time, I think it kind of creates, it makes it overwhelming, right? You're like, I'm interested in learning about herbalism. And then you start, researching herbalism, and you get so much stuff, so many approaches, so many traditions, so many models, so many plants, right? I mean, not only do we have these systems from across the world to draw from, but also they're massive materia medicas too, right? So we're not necessarily just limited to European plants or America plants or, TCM Chinese herbs, right? It's like people are using herbs from all over the world now, which I think is, again, two sides of it, right? It's amazing and awesome. And at the same time, it does add a degree of overwhelm. But one point that I like to make here is that herbal medicine has always been integrative. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially what I mean by that is that herbalists are always learning from other herbalists, right? Because what are we doing? We're healing people, right? Or the plants are healing people through us, right? We're helping people. And I think if one thing is clear, no matter where in the world you are, at what time in the history of humanity it is, people that are drawn to healing people want to genuinely heal people. They want what they do to work. And when they meet someone else that does that too, you bet they're going to ask some questions, right? If they're good at what they do, right? You want to hear, hey, what do you do for this? Or how do you use that plant? Oh, you have that plant too. What do you use it for? And they learn from one another. And this happened between individuals. This happens cross-culturally as well. I think a really great example of that is Tibetan medicine, right? The whole system of Tibetan medicine is this like conglomeration of different systems of medicine in that surrounding area. There's elements of Chinese medicine and there's aspects of Ayurveda. There's aspects of all these other different, traditional Bon, Tibetan Buddhism and the Bon tradition in there too, right? So it's Tibetan medicine in and of itself is this integrative approach. Unani Tib is a great example, right? This is Unani Tib is Middle Eastern system of herbal medicine that goes way back, that ultimately is this conglomeration of traditional Arabic medicine, Egyptian medicine, Greco-Roman medicine, right? All kind of coming together. You study Unani Tib and you look at like Galenic medicine, the traditional Greek medicine, so many similarities, right? So I think this is important to understand because we are at a time now where there sometimes can be a lot of sensitivity to, drawing upon other systems or cultures, in our work with medicinal plants. But I think if we look at history, people that use medicinal plants are constantly learning from other people, constantly learning from other cultures, constantly expanding their knowledge and their materia medica, because they just want to be able to help people more effectively and more efficiently. And we really see this in our modern days too, right? Where, I talked about it in a previous video, how, Michael Tierra's book, Planetary Herbology, was like pretty groundbreaking in the way that he's showing integrations between Chinese medicine, how we can take kind of concepts from Chinese medicine and apply them to Western herbs. David Frawley and Vasant Lad, being huge at bringing Ayurveda to the West and integrating, again, Ayurvedic kind of frameworks, Tridosha theory, Dhatu system of the tissues, and showing how that relates to Western herbs. David Winston, his whole approach is very integrative. That guy's using materia medica from all over the world, Matthew Wood's work in the practice of traditional Western herbalism, integrating Ayurvedic concepts with Greco-Roman Galenic medicine concepts, Greek humoral theory, tissue state model of physiomedicalism. Very integrative, right? And so why? Why should we have an integrative approach to herbal medicine? Well, the way I like to think of it, I kind of like to use this analogy, and maybe it's a kind of a dumb analogy, but for some reason I like the picture it paints in my head. So if you picture there's like this really complex three-dimensional statue in the middle of a room, and you've got four artists. You've got one in the east and one in the south and one in the west and one in the north, and they're given a tablet and a quill, and they're said to, draw what they see on that statue, and maybe the orientation from the east is very different from what the person from the west sees, and the person from the north and the person from the south. So everybody draws their picture, and then we look at them, and they're all going to look like very different pictures, right? Because they're looking at it from a very different perspective. Yet they're drawing it's the same statue, right? They're just looking at it from a slightly different angle. And so does that mean the one from the east is true and the one from the west is false? Or the one from the north is better than the one from the south? To me, no. They're just different ways of seeing the same thing. When we have an integrative model of herbalism, we're able to see the perspectives from the north and the east and the south and the west, so to speak, right? At the same time, it's like a 360-degree vision of understanding a person or a plant. So when we, and everyone's going to have, every system has its strengths and has its weaknesses, right? Each system has its unique approach. I mean, to me, when I look at Chinese herbal medicine, man, method of formulation is so genius and so sophisticated and, has been refined and developed for thousands of years. It's profound. Ayurvedic medicine, their whole method of, panchakarma, these cleansing protocols and rasayana, rejuvenative therapies is very unique and very, very profound. And from what I've been able to tell, you don't really see things like that in other systems of medicine. Alternative therapy in Western herbalism, very, very refined and very developed. Many folk traditions have their unique practices and approaches, right? There's just, everybody has their strength. And to me, we can learn so much more. We can become better herbalists by understanding those different approaches and giving us kind of different lenses to look through, giving us different language to understand and describe the medicinal properties of a plant. And seeing the universality amongst systems as well. I mean, to me, this is huge, which is that, again, all of those systems, they're all, painting the same statue. Their system, their picture is just their unique angle of it. But they're all painting the same statue. So if we think of herbalism, where does herbalism come from? How do people figure this stuff out? Is it all just trial and error? I would argue no, not just trial and error. Of course, there's trial and error involved, but I would argue that many of these older systems and lineages of medicine really emerged out of a deep awareness of nature, a deeper level of perception and cognition that allowed them to see into kind of the underlying pattern of the natural world and how that relates to people and how that pattern relates to plants. And this is why we actually see many similarities in traditions of medicine. For example, if we look at something like Ayurveda and look at their cosmology, kind of the way they see creation and the way they see kind of the unfolding of life and the development of plants, it's very similar to what we see in the Western alchemical tradition and their kind of creation story, their pattern of, the archetypal patterns of nature are like a 99% match to what they say in Ayurveda. Same is true with Chinese medicine. Same is true with Tibetan medicine. Of course, they have their unique variances, but my point is that there are universal principles present in herbal medicine. And that's really the part of all of this that I am very much oriented with in my approach, in the evolutionary herbalism approach, is what are those universal principles of nature? What are those universal principles of herbalism? What are the universal principles in people and in plants and in how we bring them together in a healing way? A good example of this is in alchemy, they talk about the 3 philosophical principles of sulfur, mercury, and salt. Well, you study those 3 principles, and then you go over to Ayurveda and you study the tridosha theory of Pitta, Vata, and Kapha. And you're like, wow, those are basically the same thing. And then you go over to Chinese medicine and you learn things like the 3 treasures, like Qi, Jing, and Shen. And it's those are pretty darn close to these other threefold patterns too. And then you study physiomedicalism and you hear them talk about stimulants, relaxants, and tonics. And it's that sounds vaguely familiar, like another triune pattern, right? All these systems have this threefold pattern that pops up again and again and again. Again, slightly different contexts, slightly different takes. But when I see things like that, I'm like, there's a pattern here. There's a universal principle here that all of these systems and traditions and cultures were seeing in the statue and painting from their unique lens. Talk about 5 elements, right? I can't think of a system or tradition or culture that doesn't somehow, at the very least, mention or acknowledge the importance of the elemental forces of life, right? Again, different variances here and there, but the elements are very central figures, patterns in many traditions of medicine and herbalism specifically. And so this is a way that we can approach herbal medicine that is very, to me, like very open-minded, that is very all-encompassing, that is kind of all-inclusive, and ultimately gives you a very well-rounded approach for studying people and plants. That being said, this can be very overwhelming, right? I mean, to become a proficient Chinese herbalist is like lifetimes of work. To be a very proficient Ayurvedic practitioner, lifetime of work. Same is true for Western herbalism or really any system. So it's not that, I'm not saying that you cannot just go deep into a singular system and use that system and practice it and learn it and be very effective at it. Of course you can. Obviously, people have been doing that for thousands of years, depending on the tradition, right? But I do also think that there are fundamental principles from these traditions that we can learn and understand that gives us a very holistic viewpoint. It gives us a way of understanding, say, a person, and they have a certain problem, they have a certain disease, they got a certain symptom or health condition that they're struggling with. Well, if we can look at them through the lens of like Western science, we can say, oh, they have this disease, which is associated with this particular biochemical imbalance, et cetera, et cetera. But then we can look at it, say, through the lens of Chinese medicine and say, oh, this is, forget the name of the disease. You just look at the constellation of symptoms. You look at the pattern and you might say something like, oh, this looks like a heart blood deficiency. Well, that might give you a totally different take on that pattern and bring you to some different plants that you might consider using. And then maybe you look at it through the lens of Ayurveda and you see, oh, maybe this dhatu is deficient, or there's a certain dosha imbalance present here, and we want to make sure that we incorporate some dietary and some lifestyle, and maybe make sure, the energetics of the herbs are going to be suitable for that person. And so what it does is you see the same thing through these different lenses, and it helps you refine down and be able to see what is the root of what's going on here, and ultimately give you a well-rounded approach to your herbal protocols, to your therapeutics, to your formulation, and to the things outside of herbalism. Like I said, lifestyle recommendations, dietary recommendations, things that they can do to change how they live every day to cultivate a greater level of health and well-being. Because to me, that's really what a holistic herbalist should be doing, right? I mean, one thing I learned from one of my teachers and mentors, someone I really look up to, Paul Bergner, he always says, if you're working with a person and the first thing that you think of is what herbs you're going to give them, you've completely overlooked what it means to be holistic. And I remember being like, wow, like when I first heard that, it was like, but we're an herbalist, like shouldn't we be thinking about what plants to give them? And it was like, but what I've realized he's talking about is that people get sick because of the way they live oftentimes. Like very common, a majority of the diseases that we see in Western culture are lifestyle-based diseases, right? Metabolic disease and heart conditions and diabetes and, food intolerance and a lot of autoimmune stuff. Of course, there's genetic factors, there's environmental factors, there's things outside of our control, of course. But a lot of the things people struggle with are, in a way, self-induced. It's based on lifestyle and diet and a lot of things that can be changed. We can't expect to just give an herb and have all that stuff just disappear on its own, right? We have to be able to coach people and help people along. And so this is why these different lenses, this integrative global herbalism is a very, very powerful, gives us a very powerful approach as modern herbalists to be able to help people in a more effective and efficient manner. So in the evolutionary herbalism model, one of the ways that I have kind of worked with and developed and put into practice in my work is what I refer to as the energetic architecture model. I know that sounds really woo-woo, but it is actually, in fact, very pragmatic and very practical as a means for kind of integrating these universal principles that we see reflected in different herbal cultures and traditions from around the world. And it's really kind of summarized by these 3 layers of patterns that we see in both nature as well as in tradition. And those are summarized by the 3 principles, like that triune pattern I was sharing earlier, the 5 elements, and then the septenary, the 7-fold pattern, which is, to me, brought together in the astrological tradition, the Western astrological tradition of the 7 inner planets. So 3 principles, 5 elements, and 7 planets. And these are archetypal forces of nature that in many traditions are seen as being kind of at the root of the what kind of governs the cycles and rhythms and patterns in the earth and in the cosmos, and they directly influence and affect people and plants. And we can see their properties and qualities and characteristics in people and plants on a physical level, on an energetic level, and on a spiritual level. And so in the evolutionary herbalism model, the way that I have primarily worked with that is integrating fundamental principles of, what traditional Western herbalism, so that being, phytotherapy, physiomedicalism, eclecticism, some principles in homeopathy, although I'm admittedly not a homeopath, but, homeopathy really kind of derives from Paracelsian medicine, who was like one of the founders of, alchemy, at least in the modern practice of alchemy and spagyrics. As well as Thomsonianism, so kind of these North American traditions of herbal medicine, along with principles of Ayurveda, right? Tridosha theory, their cosmological understanding, some of their materia medica. In the evolutionary herbalism model, there's a little bit of TCM dabbled here and there. I admittedly am no expert in traditional Chinese medicine, but it is something that I am learning more about. And as I learn and understand and put to use what I learned from the TCM perspective, I do see ways that it just fits right in to the energetic architecture model and the overarching evolutionary herbalism approach. 2 of the big ones that I find kind of bring about a uniqueness to my approach to integrative herbalism is the inclusion of the alchemical tradition and spagyric herbal pharmacy alongside with the medical astrology tradition. Which I think brings this whole other lens and approach to herbal medicine, not just from a therapeutic perspective, but also from an herbal pharmacy perspective, so that we are using holistic extracts of the whole plant to heal the whole person. And of course, medical astrology, of course, sends up red flags for a lot of people, but this is a very old tradition in medicine and a very effective means for holistically evaluating people, assessing the constitution, assessing the health of the organ systems, as another means for just figuring out what's going on with the person. To me, the medical astrology piece is right next to taking someone's pulse, looking at their tongue. Some people do iridology. Some people do facial analysis. Some people look at the nails, etc. So many different ways of kind of turning to the body to see what's going on. Medical astrology is just another tool in your toolkit to work with to help you get a sense for what's going on with the person so that you can come up with an effective protocol for them. And then all of that, and then as I share the evolutionary herbalism model, I really do my best to integrate modern scientific information too, right? So talking about the constituents of the plants, their pharmacological mechanism of action. Sometimes there's really great relevant scientific studies on herbs that are worth mentioning, along with the importance of nutrition, right? I always say it's like if someone has musculoskeletal cramping because of a magnesium deficiency, doesn't matter how many herbal antispasmodics you give them. If it's because of a magnesium deficiency, they need magnesium, right? Which is a lot of people these days. And so to me, this is kind of my integrative model, right? Which of course is building and standing on the shoulders of giants. A lot of the herbalists I mentioned before, there's many others. And I think I think that's the direction I really see the movement of herbalism into the future, is continuing to refine and expand and integrate these great traditions from around the world, so that we can just have a greater level of knowledge and understanding of the people we heal, of the plants we work with, and just get out there and do good work. And I think that's the thing. Like, sometimes I feel like, this can happen to me too. Sometimes we get hung up on our model, right? It's like, oh, you're TCM. Well, I'm Ayurveda. Well, I'm traditional Western herbalist. And it's like, well, I don't see things that way. And sometimes people argue about it and what's right and what's wrong. And that's too woo-woo and that's too scientific and all this stuff. And to me, it's like, well, if the model you use helps you do what I just said, figure out what's going on with the person, choose effective remedies that ultimately heal the person, who cares what model you used, right? If you used blood work, modern scientific biochemical analysis to figure that out and get them the right remedy and the person gets better, awesome, more power to you. If you use TCM differential patterns to figure out that it was liver fire rising and that led you to the right remedy, amazing. If you deciphered some dosha imbalance based on their Ayurvedic constitutional profile, and that led to good changes that brought them healing, incredible. If you look at someone's medical astrology chart and you're able to figure out what's going on with them because of a Mars transit hitting their Sun and Saturn, affecting their heart and cardiovascular system, and that led you to a great formula, great. It doesn't in the end really matter. What matters is that people get well, that the herbs that you administer, whether this is for yourself, your friends, your family, your community, or your clinic, what ultimately matters is that the people get healed. And there's many pathways to the top of the mountain. And I think what matters is that we get there, the top of the mountain being the healing of a person in need of help. And it doesn't matter what pathway we take, as long as we get there. And sometimes we take diversions, sometimes we get things wrong, sometimes we misassess and we got to reassess things and figure things out and try a different formula and make mistakes, and it happens, right? That's part of the journey. It's part of the path. And there's obstacles to overcome. Sometimes you can't see the top of the mountain. You got to get through the valleys and the dark forest first, So this is just a little bit of my thoughts on this, on integrative herbalism and kind of our unique approach to integrative herbalism here at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. So as you receive content here, in your inbox, on our social channels, through the podcast, you'll hear stuff like this kind of dabbled in here and there. Sometimes I'll be talking Ayurveda, sometimes we'll be talking alchemy, sometimes we'll be talking modern pharmacology, right? So you'll hear multiple perspectives, sometimes in the same piece of content on the same thing, right? Because that's really the approach that we are doing our best to cultivate here at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. So, hey, thanks so much for joining me here and making it to the end of another episode here. I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy life to join me here and to progress on your plant path and hopefully learn something good and new here that is beneficial for you. If you enjoyed this post, feel free to like and share and subscribe. It really does help support our channels and helps us continue to publish free content out there for the herbal community. So I'm Sage Popham. Thanks so much for joining me here in this episode. And until the next one, take care and be well.